1995, just very recently, it was commercialized, meaning handed over to Bill Gates and people like that, who at least you have to admire sometimes for their honesty. Gates, for example, has pointed out that he's attributed his success to his ability to embrace and enhance the ideas of others, mostly from the public sector, which is correct. And that's, in fact, the way the economy works. And it goes way back. It goes back to textiles and steel and everything else. And in fact, every other successful economy works the same way. New Zealand is unusual in that it's actually believed the official ideology, or chosen to believe it, and is following the path that was imposed by force on the third world, namely, they have been forced to follow free market rules. And that's a good part of the reason why India is India and England is, or was, England. Pre-Thatcher, England was England. Well, that's the history of, these are things that we can understand. I mean, maybe it's not all the economic theory isn't entirely clear, but the facts are reasonably clear, and you can draw your own conclusions from them. The United States, also still keeping to the United States, has happens to have an extremely violent labor history. It's an unusually free country in many respects, but a very violent country, and by comparative standards, and comparative, that is, to the industrial societies. The labor history is particularly violent. So hundreds and hundreds of American workers were being murdered by security forces at a time when that was just totally unknown in Europe. I mean, even in very reactionary societies. By the 1920s, it appeared that there was a lot of glee about the end of history, utopia of the masters. The labor movement had been totally destroyed, mostly by violence, and business was running everything. It looked as if everything was under control. Workers were totally intimidated. Huge stock market, going through the roof. In fact, kind of an extreme version of what's being praised today. Well, then came the 1930s, economic collapse, revitalization of popular forces, rapid revitalization, because even when they seem to be destroyed, they're sitting there right below the surface, ready to get going again. And they did. The labor organizing was militant and successful, and other popular movements developed, and they essentially forced the government to grant the kinds of rights that had long existed in other industrial societies, sort of the right to organize, some minimal form of security, and so on and so forth. That's the New Deal. And that became frightening. It became near revolutionary. The sit-down, you have to remember, a sit-down strike, which was what was taking place then, a sit-down strike is just one step short of taking over the industry and placing it under worker control, which is a radical change in the nature of the social system. And it doesn't take long for people to figure out, well, we know how to run this factory. Why let the managers, bosses around, and give the owners the profit? That's an extremely small move. Sit-down strikes were getting there. The ideas were around. It's a move that, at least in my opinion, ought to take place, but it came very close to taking place at that time. And that frightened business no end. If you read the business literature at the time, they were very frightened. They warned of what they called the hazard-facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, which was threatening traditional business rule. There was a counteroffensive that started off right away in the late 30s. It was put on hold by the war, by the Second World War, which had other priorities. But it was picked up immediately after the war. There were immediate legislative efforts to cut back the rights of labor. They started in the late 40s. They've been continuing since. And there was also a kind of an innovation. Business recognized that they could no longer control the workforce by violence. And it was therefore going to be necessary to turn far more to techniques of propaganda. There's a huge public relations industry in the United States. It is dedicated to what it calls controlling the public mind, regimenting the minds of men just as an army regiments their bodies. I'm quoting from PR manuals. That's what they were going to do. After the Second World War, there were calls in the top business world for fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinating people with the capitalist story until they can repeat it by rote and so on and so forth. Major campaign which targeted everybody. Captive audiences in factories were compelled to, submit to this propaganda, got into the schools, including the elementary schools, the universities, of course, the churches, I mean, even sports leagues. Everything was targeted. It was an enormous campaign, and it had some kind of effect. The United States was basically a social democratic country in the popular attitudes in the late 40s. Within about 10 years, it looked as if that had been controlled again. And by the end of the 50s, people were talking again about the end of ideology. I mean, things are under control, look passive and quiescent. Okay, then came the 60s. Everything blew up, massive changes, very constructive changes, I think. It led to a really substantial change in American society. Not institutional, that didn't change, but in attitudes and awareness and understanding of and implementation of human and civil rights. So women's rights, for example, rights of minorities, respect for other cultures, opposition to aggression and terror, in the environmental movement. I mean, all of these things grew out of this, major changes. That, of course, set off a counteroffensive again right away. And in fact, what's called neoliberalism is just a part of that counteroffensive. It's part of the effort to undermine democracy and the welfare state, the social contract. Another phase in the same battle that's been going on and on. And it's pretty straightforward. The neoliberalism, as it's called, economic rationalism, it's given different names. There's nothing new about it. It's an old policy. It was imposed by the British on India in the late 18th century and afterwards, and on the colonies generally. So it's not neo, it's certainly not liberalism, because the rich and the powerful insist on a powerful state that will foster their interests. That's extreme. And let me say, under Reagan, for example, state power vastly increased, along with protection and subsidy and bailouts and so on. Take a look at the last budget. It was just passed a couple months ago, and notice that the so-called conservatives, the House Majority Leader at that time, House Majority Leader Newt Gingrich, and the Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, who are full of impassioned rhetoric about how 7-year-old children have to learn responsibility and get off of the cycle of dependency and so on. They continued to hold the record, which they always hold, for government subsidies to their own rich constituents. So Gingrich has been in the lead for years, and Lott joined him this year, and that's typical. They all understand that the rich have to be subsidized and protected. That's the purpose of the nanny state. They have to be kept on their cycle of dependency. It's poor women with young children who have to learn the harsh lessons of the market, and that extends to the third world. They're all poor women with children, except for the rich elite that works for the masters. That's a good part of the structure of the world, and a good deal of the violence of modern history is the effort to impose those structures by force if people don't accept them. There are occasional exceptions, rare exceptions, where they're adopted voluntarily. New Zealand's an example. But typically it's by force. And the nanny state remains. In fact, if you look at the OECD countries, the rich countries, the state has grown relative to GNP during the period of so-called minimization of the state. It's not minimization of the state, it's a shift of the state from some degree of response to public needs to more concentration on the needs of private power. And the market is mostly a joke for lots of reasons. Well, the big change, I'll end with this, the big change that took place in the modern period, the post-World War